And the third is my most beloved grandmother, Mrs. Banu Nariman, whose birthday was only yesterday. World War II took a huge toll. It was estimated that something like between 70 and 80 million deaths took place. Most of them being civilian deaths, about 50 to 55 million. They took place because the Axis powers, so-called, aligned themselves against almost the rest of the world. And the Axis powers at that time consisted of Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, Japan, led by Emperor Hirohito, and Italy, led by Mussolini, the fascist leader who was there from 1921. On the other side, as you have just heard, you had Great Britain, France, who got knocked out relatively early, the Soviet Union, who bore the brunt of the war, and the United States, who came for the final cleanup. Now, even before the Second World War was over and Germany was defeated, Adolf Hitler committed suicide on 30th April 1945. President Truman, on 2nd May, called Justice Jackson a sitting justice of the US Supreme Court. This is something that is almost unparalleled in the history of the world, that you call upon a sitting US Supreme Court justice to step down for a long period, which is undetermined at that time, and actually formulate a trial which should take place and be the chief public prosecutor for the United States. So we find that this Nuremberg trial was really the brainchild of Justice Jackson. A little about Justice Jackson. He was an appointee of President Roosevelt, having been appointed in 1941. Unfortunately, he died by 1954. And 1 year of his justiceship on the US Supreme Court was taken away by the Nuremberg trial. He was famous not only for his dissents, but his concurring judgments as well. And above all, for the language used in his judgments, which was really the law as literature. I can only give you a smattering from two of them. One is the famous West Virginia board case, which overruled a judgment called Gobaitis within 3 years in 1943. Now remember, he was a junior justice at the time. And he wrote a beautiful judgment extolling freedom of speech and upholding the right of Jehovah's Witnesses, who are an extreme Protestant group, to say that they will not salute the flag of the United States. And in particular, this was school children who had to get up and actually salute the flag. In writing his great judgment, he said, if there is one fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in matters of politics, nationalism, religion, or any other subject concerning moral choice. Beautiful words. At almost the end of his tenure, in 1951 in Brown versus Allen, he famously said about his own court, we are not final because we are infallible. We are infallible only because we are final. He had this great felicity with words. And it was he, and it was actually on his shoulders that this entire tribunal rested. There was a Moscow Declaration of a sort of 1943, when the big three, that is Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, got together in Moscow and decided that at the end of the war, Nazi officials shall be tried by the respective nations, which will by then be set up by the Allies and which will have democratic governments. it made an exception for major war criminals. It specifically said so, and said that they may be tried as decided by the Allied powers. Now, Jackson had to hold many meetings with officials from the other three victor countries. As a matter of fact, nobody was keen on having a trial. The English, who are famous for their rule of law, said that every Nazi war criminal should be shot. No question of trial. The Russians agreed. The French agreed. But it was Jackson who, after several meetings, hammered out a charter. And that charter was hammered out by the 8th of August 1945 in London, with the concurrence of these other powers. And the charter now did something unprecedented. It set up a military tribunal of the victors. Each victor country would choose its judges. There would have to be two of them. There would have to be one judge and an associate judge. It is only the principal judge who could decide the case, but the associate judge had to sit there and help him and fill in for him if he happened to be absent. It also outlined the procedure to be followed, which was natural justice generally. Defendants were to be given witnesses. They were allowed to cross-examine, etc. As a matter of fact, the prosecution has as many as 33 witnesses, of whom one happened to be a German field marshal, Paulus. And Paulus became a field marshal only because Hitler thought that a field marshal, a German field marshal, would never surrender. So on the eve of the surrender of Stalingrad, one of the most famous battles in World War II, he made Paulus a field marshal, but Paulus surrendered nonetheless. And he was in Soviet captivity and actually gave evidence for Soviet Russia against Nazi Germany. There were as many as 80 defendant witnesses, and that included the defendants themselves. And they included such famous figures as von Rundstedt, one of the most senior and outstanding field marshals of the war, Erich von Manstein, another outstanding field marshal of the war. It is Manstein whose great plan was to send the panzer tanks rolling through the Ardennes mountains so that they'd make a surprise attack and roll into Paris, which is what happened. And that's how France capitulated very early in World War II. And of course, you also had Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. And Kesselring was again a great field marshal who managed to hold out at Monte Cassino, if you remember, in Italy, against Patton's forces for almost a year. Now, all these defendant witnesses spoke for the defense. The prosecutors consisted of Justice Jackson himself. I told you that he was a sitting US Supreme Court justice. Funnily enough, one of the US judges, Justice Biddle, Francis Biddle, happened to be a former Attorney General. So their roles were reversed. And he was assisted by Judge Parker. On the British side, you had Sir Hartley Shawcross, who was the Attorney General, and you had Sir David Maxwell Fyfe assisting him. As prosecutors, of course, you also had the very famous Norman Burkitt. Now, Norman Burkitt, if you remember, was one of the greatest cross-examiners of his time. You had Justice Lawrence and Norman Burkitt. And Burkitt was famous for one of the most famous sentences in cross-examination, which is, what is the coefficient of expansion of brass? Now he asked this question, which happened to be a deadly question, to an expert witness in order to destroy his expertise, which he did successfully. So you had Lawrence and Burkitt and the Attorney General and Maxwell Fyfe appearing for England. And similarly for France, you had a person called De Vabre, who was a judge, and another person called Falco, who was the assistant judge. And so far as the last country was concerned, the Soviet Union, you had Rudenko and then Nikitchenko and Volchkov. Now this gives you the entire prosecution and judge team of these nations. Remember, only 4 judges had the right to vote. The associate judges did not. Now, the crimes for which they were supposed to be arraigned were also set down in that charter. And a number of these crimes were crimes laid down for the first time. They didn't find themselves in any earlier Geneva Convention, which led to one major criticism saying that you are trying persons criminally for crimes which were not crimes on the date on which they were committed. But nonetheless, the crimes were, first, the crime of conspiracy for waging aggressive war. The second was crimes during the war itself, perpetrated during the war. The third were crimes perpetrated during peace. And the last was the most significant, which is crimes against humanity. Because if you remember, there were millions of persons who perished in many concentration camps that were set up by the Germans, and which the victors only came to know about when they actually entered Poland, Germany, etc., and found these ghastly, emaciated, either Jews or Gypsies or Slavs or whoever. There were as many as 6 million Jews who were exterminated in these camps, and another 6 million who were Slavs, Croats, Gypsies, etc. So you had all these defendants arraigned on these 4 counts. Now, a little bit as to the defendants themselves. Interestingly, you had 24 persons who were arraigned. And of the 24, 2 couldn't stand trial. One, Robert Ley, who was a person responsible for getting the slave labor to run factories, etc. in Germany. He committed suicide before the trial started. And the other was Alfred Krupp, who was the great man who produced iron and steel in Germany. He was too sick to stand trial. So ultimately 22 stood trial. Of the 22, it is very interesting to note that only 12 were given the death penalty. Imagine, this is a country which has waged war against the rest of the world for 6 years, exterminated millions of persons, most of whom were civilians, and only 12 death sentences were handed down. Then you had 3 who were given life sentences. You had 4 who were given sentences starting with 20 years and going down to 10 years. And again, believe it or not, you had 3 acquittals. Now we'll go to the 12 who were actually tried and sentenced to death. Please remember, Hitler was dead. The head of the German state was dead. His right-hand man, Goebbels, was the propaganda minister, had also committed suicide with him in the bunker. He was also dead, consequently. Himmler had also committed suicide. Himmler was the head of the SS organization, which was the black policemen, they were all dressed in black, who were exterminators par excellence. And of course, Reinhard Heydrich, who also was killed by a bomb blast. He being the head of the SD, which is the intelligence wing of the SS. I might tell you now that 6 organizations were also arraigned as defendants, apart from individuals. And they were the Nazi party itself, the Gestapo, which was a secret police at that time, which harassed and murdered millions of civilians. Then the SS, the SD, the Reich ministers around Hitler, and the OKW. Now the OKW is the German military force headquarters. Of these 6, 4 who were indicted were all declared criminal organizations. The last 2, the majority judgment said, were fluid or too fluid to be tried as organizations, and therefore they escaped. Now coming back to the 12 defendants who got death, the first who got death was the single most important man in Germany after Hitler, and he was Hermann Göring. He was called the Reich Marshal. Hermann Göring was a military ace. In fact, he was a flying pilot ace in World War I. And after World War I, he joined the Nazi Party in 1924. He was there at the famous Putsch, which was the event in Munich, which they celebrated every year, and slowly rose through the ranks. He was even responsible for making Hitler Führer in 1933. He then became head of the Gestapo for a short while, which you remember was that secret police organization. He became Minister of the Interior for Prussia, which was the main state in Germany, after which he became Reich Marshal and was the head of the Luftwaffe, or the Air Force. Now, this man proved to be a very obdurate and difficult witness. He was brilliant, you could see. And I've actually seen the cross-examination of Justice Jackson and how Justice Jackson had to struggle against him. And how Justice Jackson had to beg the tribunal to say, look, every time I ask him a question, he doesn't say yes or no. He goes into a long harangue of his own and tries to justify what Nazi Germany did because of what was done to them after World War I. But anyway, even though he didn't succeed, finally it was Sir David Maxwell Fyfe who, through a very brilliant cross-examination, got the necessary answers out of this extremely brilliant and obdurate witness. So Göring was the first man who was tried and sentenced to death. The person who followed him was Field Marshal Keitel. Now, ordinarily, field marshals who were mere field marshals who fought were not arraigned. But Field Marshal Keitel was much more than that. He was head of the OKW, which was the military wing. And he was a sort of lackey to Adolf Hitler himself. Everything Hitler wanted to do militarily and otherwise he did through Keitel. So Keitel was arraigned. Keitel was also awarded the death sentence. And fittingly enough, thanks to a botched hanging by an inexperienced American hangman, it took him something like 25 minutes ultimately for his life to snuff out on the rope on which he hanged. So you had Keitel as number 2. The person who followed him was Alfred Jodl. He was a colonel general. He was the immediate deputy of Keitel, therefore did exactly the same thing that Keitel did. Now mind you, every one of these witnesses except Göring tried to say that what we were doing was following orders, which was the main defense taken by all the witnesses. Article 8 of the military tribunal took care of that. It said that if you take up this defense, it will not absolve you of guilt, but it may go in mitigation of sentence. So the result was that all of them who said that we only followed orders didn't get very far. And people like Jodl also hanged. Now after Jodl and after these 3 people, you had 2 Austrians who were die-hard anti-Semites. You had a man called Arthur Seyss-Inquart. He hated Jews pathologically. And he was another person who was euphemistically called protector of the Netherlands and of Poland, in which millions of innocent people died. He also ultimately got the hangman's rope. And with him was the other Austrian, a man called Kaltenbrunner. Now, Kaltenbrunner was again an SS high up and actually succeeded Reinhard Heydrich as chief of the SD, which I told you was the intelligence wing of the SS. Again, a man on whose hands a huge amount of blood was. So these 2 Austrians now make it 5. Then you had Hans Frank, who was the Governor General of Poland, in which the maximum deaths took place in concentration camps. It wasn't very difficult to hang him. And then a person called Frick, who was Minister of the Interior and a successor to Hjalmar Schacht for the Reich Bank. He also was hanged. Then you come to the famous Alfred Rosenberg, or the infamous Alfred Rosenberg, who was considered the philosopher priest of the Nazis. He ran 2 newspapers and he tried to give reasons for the extermination of the vermin race, as he called them. Along with him went Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was foreign minister. You remember the famous Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was done in August 1939, so that the Soviet Union could be kept out of the war, and Hitler could then go and invade France. So these 2 were also hanged. And finally, you also had Julius Streicher, who was a person who ran a newspaper called Der Stürmer, also virulently anti-Semitic, and found to be almost of moron level when they took IQ tests. Couldn't answer questions. He just had this sort of way of hammering against a particular race without any reason. And finally, a man called Sauckel, who was also a person who gathered labor in order to run the huge Nazi war machine. So these 12 were the defendants who were hanged. Now, when we come to persons who got life, and this is a little surprising, first person was Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess, in fact, was even more important than Hermann Göring, because he was the immediate deputy Führer for a long time until Hermann Göring took over and went beyond him during the war. He was Hitler's immediate confidant in the Landsberg prison in 1924. He took down in writing Hitler's ravings in Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, and was an ardent devotee or fan of the Führer. Now, Hess was a person who was a little mentally deranged, but thought that he would do his Führer the greatest feat which could achieve by him alone. He took a Messerschmitt and on 10th May 1941 flew all alone to Scotland and landed in Scotland. When they picked him up, nobody believed that this was the 3rd most important man in the Reich. He thought that he would broker a peace between Britain and Germany, and he was only following what Hitler said in Mein Kampf. Because Hitler said that the moment you have a war on 2 fronts, you are doomed. So he said, I will go in person, broker a peace, get Britain out of the war, so that then we can attack the Soviet Union. Of course, he failed miserably. And he remained in prison throughout. In fact, he continued in prison with his life sentence. Most others were let off by then or had completed their sentences. And at age 92 in Spandau, where he was kept, he ultimately committed suicide. So Hess surprisingly got life. Incidentally, there was one judgment that was written by Justice Lawrence and concurred in by the other 3 powers. The Russian judges dissented. And one of the points on which they dissented was on Hess. They said, no, he was number 2 to Hitler. He may have slipped to number 3, but he was number 2. He should have been hanged. So that was one important point of dissent. The other 2 points of dissent by the Russians were, they said, no, every organization, including the 2 that were let off, were all military, all criminal. They were all scoundrels. So they also had to be declared criminal. And the third on which the Russians dissented was, they said, there cannot be acquittals. This will be a complete mockery if you have persons like this who are all bigwigs in that sense, who are standing trial, 3 of whom get acquitted. So we come now to the acquittals immediately. Who was acquitted? Hjalmar Schacht. He happened to be the president of the Reich Bank. And he was acquitted because he was president before the war broke out. And it was proved at least, not a sort of violent and virulent Nazi supporter. So he got completely acquitted of all 4 war crimes. Then, apart from Hjalmar Schacht, you also had 2 others. One was a minor, some official in the Interior Ministry called Fritsch. He was also let out. But the third again was a very big fish. He was a man called Franz von Papen. Now, von Papen happened to be Chancellor of Germany itself, helped Hitler become Chancellor in 1933, became his Vice Chancellor. Then, however, made a speech at Marburg in 1934, speaking of how Nazis generally had throttled freedom of speech, which was considered to be completely out of line by the Führer at that time. Nonetheless, he continued as minister and then ambassador to Vienna and ambassador to Turkey. So even this big fish ultimately was acquitted. So now we have 3 acquittals. And what about the 4 who were given sentences, not life sentences? Albert Speer, another very, very important person in the war, a man who wrote Inside the Third Reich after he came out of prison, was Hitler's favorite. In fact, he was his favorite architect. Hitler had dreams of being an architect, artist, etc. And he somehow took to this young man. But then ultimately he was the person who prolonged the war because he became armaments minister. And as armaments minister, he had to engage huge slave labor. Now, despite all this, because ultimately he stood up against Hitler at the end, because Hitler had a scorched earth policy, he said destroy everything in Germany. If the allies are going, the other powers are going to come in and destroy, we will destroy it ourselves first. He halted that. So ultimately, anyway, the tribunal felt that he should get 20 years. And he served his 20-year sentence and then wrote that famous book, Inside the Third Reich. Along with him, you had another person who happened to be a person who was a Hitler youth person, Baldur von Schirach. And he was the person who recruited young boys at the end of the war because there were no men left, who made that famous dash, if you remember, to Antwerp. And it was called the Battle of the Bulge at the time. And a lot of these young boys were recruited by this person. So anyway, this person also got 20 years. A person called von Neurath got 15 years because he was Reich Protector of Bohemia, Moravia. And he was too soft, according to Hitler. So he was removed and Heydrich was put in. So he got 15 years. And then surprisingly, Admiral Donitz. Now, Admiral Donitz became Führer after Hitler, the day he committed suicide. And he was the head of the Kriegsmarine and the head of the U-boat section of the German Navy, which wreaked the most destruction on not only vessels, but the British Navy itself. Anyway, he ultimately got only 10 years. The other persons who got life were Erich Raeder, who was the person who actually, Grand Admiral, who actually built up the entire Navy. And finally, a man called Walter Funk, who also happened to be a person connected with propaganda and a successor of Hjalmar Schacht, as I told you earlier, at the Reich Bank. So with this array, you actually have, at the Nuremberg trials, one section of the rule of law being vindicated. Please remember, it is important to remember that, number one, it's a victor tribunal, as was correctly pointed out by the Chief Justice. Number two, strangely enough, there was no Italian who was arraigned. Now, mind you, Italy under Mussolini waged war again against the world right till 1944. There were any number of Italian politicians, Italian generals, Italian admirals, etc., all alive, none of whom faced trial. So this was one other very major flaw that the Nuremberg trial had. For some reason, Italy was not arraigned here. When we come to the Tokyo trials, there are even bigger flaws. The Tokyo trial actually centered around one person and one person alone, Douglas MacArthur. Who was Douglas MacArthur? He was first He was, of course, a US general. He was one of the only five-star generals. There were four others in World War II. But he was a military hero of the United States. He was also made Field Marshal of the Philippines Army. Eisenhower very cattily said he was made Field Marshal of a non-existent army. But never mind, he was still Field Marshal of the Philippines Army. And after the Japanese onslaught on the Philippines in 1942, he had to retreat and walk out with all his troops and went to Australia for 2 years. And ominously said, I shall return. And return he did in 1944. And you have that very famous photograph of this man with dark goggles actually walking in the water and coming up to the mainland in the Philippines. Now, he as Supreme Allied Commander for the East himself drew up a military tribunal charter like the one at Nuremberg. This was, by the way, not government sponsored. This was done by him alone, in his capacity as Supreme Commander. He borrowed heavily from the charter, but there were 2 or 3 important differences. One was, you didn't have 4 countries here, you had 11 countries. Apart from the 4 we spoke about. You had Canada, you had Australia, you had New Zealand, you had China, you had India, we were there as well, and you had the Philippines and the Netherlands, making up 11 nations. So you had judges appointed from 11 nations. Again, big difference. The judges were appointed by MacArthur, not by their individual countries, as was done in Nuremberg. Finally, the charter said that MacArthur as Supreme Commander could also review their judgments. He could review them downwards but not upwards, which meant that suppose somebody was given 20 years, he could make it 10 years, but he couldn't make it life. Now these 11 sat and the Tokyo trials began. The Nuremberg trials, I told you, took 1 year. The Tokyo trials took 2.5 years. There were 419 witnesses examined on both sides. And ultimately, the Tokyo trial yielded by a majority, there were 5 judgments written, by a majority, 16 life sentences and 7 death sentences, making 23. And if you add to 23 2, then 2 others who were foreign ministers got 20 years and 7 years. So 25 ultimately were indicted, though 28 were arraigned, like in Germany. 2 were too sick to stand trial, and 1 had committed suicide. So 28 became 25. And as I told you, the 7 death sentences were actually meted out to 2 prime ministers. One was a man called Tojo and another man called Hideki. So these 2 prime ministers were part of persons who got the death sentence. The others were generals, admirals. And the 16 who got life were from every walk of life, politicians, civilians, judges, etc. And what is interesting in these trials is the fact that Justice Webb, who was the Australian judge and was the president of these 11 judges, spoke about Hirohito's not being arraigned. Now, Hirohito's not being arraigned would have been something like Adolf Hitler, had he been alive, not being arraigned for Nuremberg. So it was a very serious gaffe. And it was done on purpose. Because MacArthur felt that unlike Germany, which had been defeated and divided, Japan must continue. And it will continue as an American protectorate. And who better to continue it than the emperor himself, because everybody believed in the emperor. So the emperor had to be kept from being tried. This was one very major flaw. Justice Webb, the Australian judge, made it clear, yes, this was a very major flaw. But nonetheless, they are all now before us. They have committed huge crimes. By the way, here there were 9 crimes. 55 became 9. And the 9 crimes were largely really 2 crimes. conspiracy to wage aggressive war, and war crimes committed against country X, country Y, etc., which is why they became 9 indictments. Now, on these 9 indictments, as I told you, 16 got life and 7 got death sentences. What is also important to remember in the Japanese trials is now the dissenting judgments. You had a dissent by the French judge, a man called Bernard. But unfortunately, it was a dissent only in form. In substance, though he dissented on many points, including ex post facto laws, procedural problems, etc., he ultimately signed the majority judgment. Then you had Jaranilla, who was the Filipino judge, who then went on to say that what has been meted out by way of sentence is too mild. So he did sign the majority judgment, but he said, no, most of these people should have got death for the things that they did. So he also was a dissentient in that sense. But there were 2 other dissents which were interesting. One was from the Netherlands judge, Rolling. He would have acquitted 5 persons and given different sentences to the others. And of course, our own Justice Radha Vinod Pal. He wrote this 1200-odd page judgment. And what he said was very interesting for all future military tribunals. First, he said, Japan may have been actually waging a defensive war against the colonialism from Western powers. Then he went on to say, probably correctly, that all these were criminal offenses only at the time of the charter and not at the time they were committed. So for that reason also, everybody had to be acquitted. But the most important reason he gave was that the victors themselves ought to have been arraigned. And the victors here are the US in particular, because they dropped 2 atom bombs. Now the 2 atom bombs killed as many as 150 to 200,000 people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, most of them being civilians. So he drew attention to the single most important fact that it is the victor ultimately who seems to be meting out his own justice. And if the victor ultimately metes out his own justice, where is justice? Where is the rule of law? So we find now at the end of this talk 3 strands which emerge. One is that you saw that Italians were not arraigned at all. So completely arbitrary prosecution. You also saw that the head of the Japanese was not arraigned, Hirohito. May have been for pragmatic reasons, but surely pragmatic reasons cannot absolve Adolf Hitler if a new German state were to be put up. So that was one other very major flaw. And the third most major flaw was the victor's own war crimes were never looked into. A utopian dream which may become reality in the future, thanks to Justice Radha Vinod Pal, is having a charter first drawn up by an organization like the UN, which clearly outlines what are war crimes, so that you never have this finger pointing at you saying they are all ex post facto. So clearly delineate what a war crime is, first. Second, provide for judges from neutral countries. Very important, because if the victor is to decide about the vanquished, necessarily there will be inbuilt bias. So have neutral judges, again set up by a UN charter or some other world body. And third, that without looking at either the victor or the vanquished, arraign those responsible for war crimes. For it is only then that we can, even as a people, as human beings, look forward to universal world peace, which has thus far eluded us and probably will elude us, at least in the near future. Thank you all very much.